all going. Welcome. As you have noticed in several of the town halls, this is all unscripted, free-flowing conversation, not edited. And today we have such an important topic, and it has to do with the context of the election. What does the election mean? We have community members who are all running organizations that impact so many different parts of the Chicago area. And the question really is to them, what should elected officials be expected to accomplish during the first few months in office? How can they be true partners? How could elected officials be true partners in developing safe, strong, healthy communities out there? Are there specific policies, maybe actions, that can bring swift results to all those underserved communities too? And urgent issues. What do the elected officials, once the election rolls around and everyone's going to be in office, and the next, obviously, when they get sworn in, what are those issues, the urgent issues that need to be tackled? So joining me on the panel, I do want to introduce everyone. First of all, welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, nice to have everyone here. So let me, if folks are online, I just want to start so you know who we're talking to. And if you don't mind, just kind of give a wave as I mention your name. So the first person I'd like to introduce is Felicia Davis, the president and CEO of the Chicago Foundation for Women. Felicia is a proud Chicagoan. I love how you say in your profile here, self-described girl from the South Side. She leads the Chicago Foundation for Women, which funds organizations solving huge problems for women and also for girls. We're talking about economic insecurity, violence, lack of access to healthcare. Paul Liu, do you mind waving your hand and showing everyone who you are? The Chief Executive Officer of the Chinese American Service League, also known as CASEL. Paul is a community advocate, decades of nonprofit service as well, including the Boys and Girls Club, the Vietnamese Association of Illinois. Now, though, he leads CASEL, and CASEL connects families, individuals in the greater Chicago Chinese community to resources and vital support too. We're talking everyone from children to seniors to make sure that they have healthy lives as well. They also educate tomorrow's workforce and put immigrants on pathways to citizenship. So welcome, Paul. We also have Angie Lobo. Give us a wave, Angie. You're in the top part left hand of my screen here. Executive Director of the Indo-American Center. Angie has a long history of social justice work in Chicago. We're talking about criminal justice reform, affordable housing. How important is that issue right now? Now she leads the Indo-American Center, which addresses the needs of South Asian immigrants from 30 different nations. Karen Freeman Wilson is the president and CEO of the Chicago Urban League. Karen has led the Urban League since January, so you've had some interesting months, right? Since February and March here going into this year.
For sure.
She is formerly the mayor of Gary, Indiana, where she led for 7 years. You may recognize her as a former elected official there. First female to lead the city of Gary, first African-American female mayor in Indiana. And as a former elected official, of course, she has deep experience in addressing issues that impact urban communities. We'll be tapping into that. That's critical for right now. Dennis Mondero, executive director. Hello, Dennis, there he is. The Chinese Mutual Aid Association. Familiar with the Chinese Mutual Aid Association as well. He served on the board of directors 10 years, has been the executive director the last 7 years. He is a first generation immigrant, can speak to those issues. Born in the Philippines, his family moved to Uptown in 1971. CMAA targets low income immigrant and refugee communities, Asia, Africa, Europe, Central and South America as well. So welcome, Dennis. And last but not least at the moment is Ray Gonzalez. Ray, do you mind giving us a wave? Last one here. I'm president and CEO of El Valor, and Ray served as a chair for El Valor's board of directors for 33 years before becoming president in 2015. Long ties to that organization, clearly. Through his leadership, El Valor is ranked among the 25 largest Hispanic serving organizations in the country. It has grown into a nationally recognized multicultural, multi-purpose organization supporting children, from the smallest children, people with disabilities, and their families, of course. So to our panelists, thank you so much, and thanks for joining us today as we take on this topic of the election and its impact on organizations. So I want to dive right into it. And just to let everyone who's watching online know, we are going to ask a question of each of our panelists here, and one at a time. But after the first initial question, after the person answers that question, anyone is welcome to join in on that topic. And Ray, I'm going to start with you because we are at a critical time right now, just days away from the November election, clearly. And with the new leaders in place or leaders who have been reelected, not only on the federal, the state, the local level, from you, where you sit for El Valor, and clearly all the organizations here represented, what are the most critical and urgent issues that must be addressed?
Well, the first thing, and I think Joe Biden said it best, is that he would be the president for everyone, both Republicans and Democrats. I think our elected officials need to learn from that. Just because you won with one particular vote, you have to understand that you represent all the individuals in your community, and that the fact that we have poor folks, we have individuals with immigrant backgrounds. So in the case of El Valor, we serve a number of immigrants. Our community is suffering. They live in fear. We have to have discussions with our children as to what happens if their parents don't show up at the end of the day. There's an unfairness, there's an inequality as to what's going on. And our elected officials are to blame for that and how they behave. And we have to change that narrative. And they have to understand we're all Americans, and and that they should represent all Americans. And that's the first thing. The second thing, in terms of equity, we need part of social justice is equity in terms of resources and dollars, and that communities are really in need, not just one community, but all these communities. And I would hope that they would understand what those needs are of every individual in their respective districts. And then the third thing for me, and this is close to my heart, is that in our case in Illinois, we probably rank in the bottom 5 for funding for adults with disabilities. In particular, in the Latino community, we don't have the resources in terms of adults with disabilities. And at El Valor, we have to be that voice. But I would hope that elected officials would make sure that the most vulnerable of our community are taken care of.
Would anyone else like to join in on that part of the conversation? And Deanna and I talked about this earlier, and I failed to mention at the very, very beginning. So no reflection on Ray, but just part of my introduction too was that our conversation is going to include many different perspectives, and the viewers out there, you may agree, you may disagree. Please understand that these are reflections of everyone who's represented here from the organizations, and don't reflect ABC7's official stance or anything like that. So I want to put that out there because we are talking politics, and it's important for us as a news organization to be neutral stance on everything. But people have opinions, so we want to hear those opinions too. So does anyone else want to kind of address what Ray's talking about? Multiple things here when it comes to urgent needs and issues.
I would certainly jump in, Stacey, and I think it's important that elected officials, the successful ones at every level, presidential, at the state level, where there are state races, at the local levels, set an atmosphere of unity. We have seen probably this time more than any such rancor and such a vitriolic election. I mean, name calling, folks being just vilified. And so I think it's important for those who are successful to say, number one, as Joe Biden said and Mr. Gonzalez said, I'm going to represent everyone. But even more than that, we have to get along. We have to learn how to communicate. We have to learn how to disagree without being disagreeable. And so you can set an environment in communities that will really give rise to a better dialogue and a better life for everyone. And people will talk about infrastructure, and that's important. And people will talk about immigration reform, and that's important. And people will talk about the importance of dealing with the coronavirus. All of those things are important. But unless you set the stage for that and create an environment for that, for us to really have discourse, then I don't know that we'll be successful.
I would like to just jump in. Also, I agree with Ray and Karen's comments about leadership. I think where leadership starts is having an understanding of empathy. And that's really important. And to have empathy is to understand the community needs and what must be done. It's not just about effective communications, but to take actions upon those communications. And I hope, my hope is in our community, especially the Chinese community, is that communications are out and soon for whatever administration may arise for the new after the election, but making sure these actions has empathy for these struggling communities. Many immigrant communities, including Chinatown, has struggled throughout the last few years, and with the pandemic, is double and triple the impact of many of our lives. So I just want to make sure that the elected official knows that empathy starts with connecting with the communities. And as they make policies and they change policy or add new policy, is for them to listen to the communities and the community leaders on what the needs are for the communities.
You know, Karen, I was going to get to you next, thinking that, hello, I see Perry Irmer there. Welcome.
Hey there, how are you?
Although we have you sideways, I don't know if everybody else does. We might have to turn your camera, so welcome.
Let me do that. I had it on landscape.
While you're doing that, I do want to tell people that Perry Irmer, who's joining us right now, is with Chief Executive Officer, President and CEO of the DuSable Museum of African American History. So welcome to our conversation as we get here.
Better?
You know, back to Ms. Karen, I was just, since you were an elected official, I hear you saying, and I hear others agreeing, Paul agreeing here to the tone of the conversation and what needs to be done from elected officials. Paul was also alluding to the whole conversation about policies, looking at policies. So I hear you speaking about tone, that was your message, but as an elected official, is it tone? Is it policies? Is it laws and changes? Like the action item of that needs to be taken?
So the elected official in me will always deal with policy because right now our citizens are in such great need. We have seen a CARES Act or a subsequent legislation to the CARES Act get stalled in Congress. And so the mayor in me says, hey, you need to get in there and do something to provide relief. Relief to individuals, relief to companies, relief to industries, relief to cities. I mean, the city and the state both have gaping deficits. And so the elected official in me is always going to say that we have to address the policy needs. And then as we see the virus surge, you now have an increased need for PPE in hospitals. Many rural communities are running out of beds. They're running out of supplies. And so we're almost going back to where we were in March and April. And so, you want to call on folks to say, put aside all of your differences. We need you to get along enough to do something, because if you're at the local level or even at the county level, you don't have the luxury of saying that I can't get it done because of what's happening in Washington or Springfield. You just don't have that luxury. You've got to do something.
I'd like to bring Dennis into the conversation at this point, because Dennis, you were talking about really the time frame of all of this, which is being alluded to right now, and the critical timing of the first 100 days of what really needs to get done once we see the election, once we see these newly elected leaders, or maybe their incumbents being reelected. That time frame and what you hope to see as well, and how critical that time frame is for so many of the organizations, including yours.
Sure, Stacey. Thank you. There's so much to be done in the first 100 days. As a person in the voice to give voice to the immigrant and refugee community, I hope that at the federal level, we can continue work on comprehensive immigration reform. That is something that we've been trying to accomplish for years on both sides of the aisle. And it can also be something that will be a necessary step to help the economy rebound from our pandemic. We also hope that any administration will recognize the important work of social service organizations being a vital safety net to our communities during these extraordinarily difficult times, and that continued and increased funding needs to continue so that we can help our communities. For instance, CMAA, we were one of the agencies working with the City of Chicago. I know that the Urban League was also another one that we were given money to distribute for rental assistance to low-income families who have been affected by COVID. Now we're distributing that money, but then we're also bracing and having conversations about what will be a likely tsunami of evictions once the foreclosure moratorium lapses, right? And as so many families will become rendered homeless, what will occur when that happens in 2021? So there's just so many areas in which we need to have the next administration, whether it's continued administration going in for another 4 years or a new administration at the federal level, how can they really help our economy rebound? And knowing that our organizations locally and throughout the country are vital to help that recovery.
You're bringing up so many different issues. Angie, I'm sure you could join this part of the conversation too, with the immigrant community that you deal with as well. Is there, I guess, as I listen to all of you, is there a priority list that could be agreed upon? I mean, because there's so many different issues, right? But is there a way to prioritize this? When you talk about housing, that's immediate. When you talk about people getting tossed out of their homes, COVID help, healthcare, like all those feel so immediate. What are your thoughts on all of that, Angie?
Yeah, I think that we shouldn't, in some ways, trying to enumerate them kind of diminishes the importance of how it's truly a holistic package. And I think that right now, what is really challenging is the instability and the lack of access. So all of those pieces are an essential part to a comprehensive plan to make sure that our communities are strong. And we know when the community is strong, it has a positive impact all around, right? So the rising tide lifts all boats. So I think, it's the CARES Act is one of those essential items that could be actually the omnibus all-inclusive thing that really includes a lot of these different pieces. And we know that the instability that the immigrant community is facing, it's with policies, as far as, every new day there's a new immigration policy that comes down. Okay, now the citizenship application fee is doubled. Okay, now there's a new Muslim ban. Okay, now students have to, if they are online classes, they have to leave. Oh, just kidding, you can stay, right? This constant upheaval is really taking a toll on the community. So part of what we need from leadership is calm, stability, and investment, and just saying, we value you as a community. We can't do everything at once, but these are the comprehensive list of things that we know are important to support you and to keep your community strong. My light turned off.
Anyone else like to chime in on the 100 days, critical 100-day time frame?
Yeah, Stacey, I will too. This is Felicia Davis. I agree with what all of my colleagues here have said. And I think if we were to sum it up, we are simply asking to put people first and to put policies that center people. Each of our organizations has been working tirelessly to support the most needy individuals in our communities. And that is often lost in a lot of the rancor that's happening. Like what's happening on the ground is kind of lost. So we're not expecting a bunch of pie in the sky policies. What we really want are policies that really center people. And when you said, how do you pull this together? I mean, it goes back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We need to have people safe, housed, food, like the things that should be centered immediately are the things that sustain and give life, the things that help people remain healthy in the middle of a global pandemic, health pandemic. And we have seen the inequities there. So we should address some of those inequities. We need to make sure that people are stable. So if that includes additional rounds of funding to help the frontline organizations like the ones represented here and others with additional PPP monies or emergency income loans or whatever the case may be, or other grants, federal grants and state grants to support this really important frontline work that's going on between all of the organizations. So I think if you were to, when Angie said, you know, the holistic approach is that each of us represents a different perspective, but ultimately what we're saying is that it needs to be people-centered. It needs to be put the lives, the real lived lives of all of these experiences first, and not just the policy that sounds good on paper or that has a really great soundbite, because ultimately those policies land in communities and they land on people, and either they're landing and helping people, giving them a lift, or they're landing on people and keeping them oppressed and pushing them down.
Well said.
No, and I see a lot of head bobs like this, like, yes, right? And I feel like everything you're talking about cannot be taken out of the context of COVID. Right. Leading all your organizations, I mean, does that seem like a statement of the obvious? Of course, but it has to have turned so many of your operations completely upside down, changed dramatically. And it just feels like elected leaders need to see it through that lens first. Is that correct? Or I don't know. I'd love to hear your opinions on all of that.
You know, it is almost sad. What struck me when Felicia was talking, and even Angie, was that we are here talking in the richest country in the world about just getting basics to people: food, clothing, and shelter. We have almost devolved to that position. But yeah, that's exactly what it is, because those who are in elected office, and I don't say this about local officials because I believe they get it, but I'm really talking about in some instances at the federal level, and even sometimes at the state level, that people don't understand the impact that policies have on them as individuals. And, you know, I have a view into both states, right? And so I think that Governor Pritzker has done a great job in really challenging times, given the different landscape in Illinois. But in Indiana, it was like, you know, the governor started out on a great thing, sheltering in place, use your mask, and then he got the heat and he couldn't sustain it. And so we're all open for business. Nothing's changed. And I mean, in fact, it's gotten worse, you know, from a health standpoint. But he's talking about, you know, oh, we're fine, let's open for business. And we have a 20% positivity rate in Indiana. That makes absolutely no sense.
I would suggest, Stacey, that, you know, we need to hold our elected officials to a higher standard. As leaders in our community, we don't work on one issue at a time. You know, we're certainly concerned about COVID, but we're also concerned about how our community is being treated, about funding, about employees, about safety, about hunger. They should be able to do the same thing. They have to have a 90-day plan that addresses a number of critical issues. So that means they have to learn, they have to read, and they have to develop policies and strategies in those first 90 days and develop an action plan as to how they're going to handle those things. You know, I think we need to hold them to a higher standard. And it's not just one thing, it's multiple things, because all of our communities have multiple issues, and we can't let any one issue put it to the side, whether it's hunger, whether it's housing, whether it's health. They've got to be able to be flexible and adapt to work on a number of emergent issues in their districts.
How doable is that on the state and local level in Illinois and in the communities you serve? how doable is that? I guess I'm interested to hear, like, yes, this is possible, or I don't know, is it possible? As a journalist, I want to ask, is that possible?
I think it comes down to a matter of priorities, quite frankly. We know that it's about choices. And what we know is that there are only hard choices ahead. All of the easy things have already been tried many, many years ago, whether they worked or not. And so now it comes down to, budgets are all about priorities, and they help us understand what are the most important things that that people care about, or that an elected official cares about. And so, when I look at the impact that the COVID pandemic has had on women, for example, women have been 4 times as likely to be forced out of the workforce than men. In September alone, from an economic security standpoint, I'm worried about that. In September alone, nearly 1 million women left the workforce because they did not have reliable education or childcare. And that's a generation. The impact for this, the impact of that single act will be felt in their retirement, will be felt by their children, their families, the economic security of those families. And certainly that means that organizations like ours and the organizations represented here, that means more families will be coming for assistance because they no longer have that economic driver helping them. From a healthcare standpoint, we have seen this disproportionate impact on the front line, our frontline workers, overwhelmingly women, overwhelmingly immigrants, our caregivers, overwhelmingly immigrants and women. And we have seen those things. And part of, I think, what I feel is a responsibility of our elected officials and policymakers, to be truthful about that, is to look at the impact, not this, peanut butter approach, everybody gets the same amount, but to look at where the disparate impact really is, and then to design solutions that actually target those impacts. Today is Latina Equal Pay Day, as it were, and that one of our Latina sisters has to work until this day of the year, October 29th, to make the same amount of money for the same work that a white man made at the end of last year, so before the global pandemic had even started. Those inequities need to be addressed. The safety of women, that has to be addressed. We have been without the reauthorization, I hate to keep singing this song over and over again, of the Violence Against Women Act. In containment of COVID, domestic violence has seen a resurgence, and with people having to shelter in place, and this is across all of our organizations, across all of the demographics that are represented here today, this is happening. It's a separate silent pandemic that's happening in homes. And so without the reauthorization, the funds don't flow to make relief possible. And so to me, it's a matter of prioritization. And I simply, I agree with Ray. It just can't be, well, I can only do one thing. We have to be able to walk, chew gum. Women do it. I just walk, chew gum, feed the baby, clean the kitchen, all at the same time.
All the time. And I'd like to echo what my sisters here are saying. I run an African American history museum, right? We're the oldest independent Black museum in the nation, and for me, trying to juggle political speak and policy speak, to me they're one and the same. And why is that? Because Black people, and throughout the history of this nation, have been the victims of politics, right? Why is that? Because politics make policy, right? And bad public policy has created most of the socioeconomic woes experienced by Black people and poor people across this country. So, today, with the current administration, you have to look at what you are funding, and that's the evidence, right? You fund what you care about, right? And if you don't care about history, if you don't care about science, if you don't care about facts, if you don't care about human beings, that's what is being reflected right now in the decisions that are being made and the policies that are being carried out at a federal level. I agree. Our local leaders, Mayor Lightfoot, fabulous job. JB is doing a great job for us locally. they're doing the best they have with what they've got, right? And it's that lack of national leadership. And the priority, I believe the priorities for the first 100 days obviously are having a national plan to deal with COVID, to deal with the vaccine, making that vaccine, convincing us that despite everything that's come before, that vaccine is going to be safe, right? And effective, but mostly safe. And we as Black people have an incredibly dark history in terms of healthcare and government, right? Going all the way back to the Tuskegee experiments, going all the way back to the Henrietta Lacks situation and her stolen body tissue, right? So it's going to be a very tough sell, especially for anything that originated out of this administration, which unfortunately the current administration, I believe, is an existential threat to Black people and to poor people across the nation. You know, we now are faced with the potential rejection of the Affordable Care Act, right? So not only are all of these women's health issues going to, as bad as they are right now, in terms of the disparate impact on Black people, brown people, women of COVID, now what you're saying is that there is a risk that just having ever been exposed, like everyone in the country can be said to have been exposed to COVID, and the carriers will just declare everyone has a pre-existing condition, right? We don't know enough about this disease to know how it has already damaged brain tissue, heart muscle, circulatory system, cardiovascular system, lungs, all of that. Everything that the insurance companies now want to blame on COVID, they're able to do because we don't have enough knowledge because the science has been ignored, right? So the protection, or, you know, depending on what happens between now and then, the recovery and the restoration of the Affordable Care Act, the preservation of protection for pre-existing conditions. And then, you know, let's, you know, address the elephant in the room, which of course is the police violence, right? And the coddling of white nationalists and domestic terrorists. And if let's look at it this way, and these are the statistics, right? Between May 26th and August 31st of this year, 59 Black people were killed by police. That's beyond George Floyd, that's beyond Breonna Taylor, that's beyond, you know, every name that we're seeing in the news, right? And these are issues that have to be addressed at the federal level. We have to address this qualified immunity for police officers that seems to have no exception for intentional torts, right? Intentional killings, and no one's accountable. And at the end of the day, what do we do locally? It's we, the taxpayers, who are paying that bill. We are paying the settlements. We are paying, right, the court costs. We are paying for our police officers to kill people. And we are paying for that liability instead of having it land where it should land, which is with the bad actors and asking the police to police themselves, right? And I'm not trying to dump on police, I really am not, but we have a problem. Houston, we have a problem, right? And that has to be addressed at a national level. It can't just be done locally. And we won't have that confidence in our government, whether it be healthcare, whether it be public safety, whether it be education, whether it be housing, until there is a true acknowledgement and acceptance and acknowledgement and realization of the conditions that we are in right now and that they have to be addressed, right? Looking at maternal health care and infant health care, at the mortality rates amongst Black women dying in childbirth or thereafter, it's outrageous. It's like a third world country. And that is because of systemic racism and underfunding and inaccessibility to healthcare. So there's so many programs that we as Americans need that are impacting Black and brown and poor people so disproportionately. And those are the things that I would like to see addressed in a policy program or policy statement or agenda of the new administration. I think certainly institutions like the Dusable Museum, we're all about education, right? So we want to make sure that we all understand what came before, why we are where we are, why these conditions exist, and then to go forward and see what changes we have to make or demand of our political leaders and our educators and everyone holistically who's at the table to, as we move forward, make good history together, right? Make a better history than the one we are teaching right now, right? And we can change that. We can change that. We can teach civics in our schools. We can teach complete American history, right? Not Black History Month is the time that you learn about Black things and then the rest of the year you don't have to know nothing, right? Not Women's History Month is the time you have to pay attention to what we great women have done throughout millennia, and then after March you can forget about it, right? That sort of thing drives this idea of Black people and women somehow being separate from that American narrative, right? When there would be no American narrative without each of our components and each of our contributions. And that has to be acknowledged first, because until you start to perceive America as being all Americans are as being important to that American narrative and that American history, you have an excuse to discount the rest of us, right? And so those are the types of things that I think need a real paradigm shift in the way we think about it. We are going to be promoting for our 60th anniversary, again, the oldest independent Black museum in the nation, the idea that every month is Black History Month, right? And hopefully that concept will catch on. Every month is Black History Month. And now is the time when we really have to make good history together. And so I'll send it back to the group because I think these are really some of the essential overarching philosophical commitments that must be made right now.
You are really unloading a lot of issues on the table. So many there as a journalist. I was like, oh my gosh, where can we take it from here, there, and that's so many issues. So I appreciate that. I appreciate all the different, and I had this original list of where I thought we were going to go, but we're all over the place, which I think is a great thing. One of the things that, no, Ms. Perry, one of the things while you were speaking to me, I thought, you know, I find it interesting that there are certain issues that the administration, there's certain messages, right? And actions, messages, actions, and tones that the administration has put through. But as leaders of all your organizations, how important is it to be able to work no matter what party it is? And I feel like, you know, that is a monster challenge for all of you as you look at different funding from different sources or the threat of being cut off from funding. And how realistic is that from where you sit when it depends on who's actually been elected on every level?
Very realistic, very vital, right?
Are you worried?
Yes, and well, so obviously what happens in the election day, and everyone's going to have their personal politics, and I know that many of the viewers will have like who they prefer to have as president. I think that many of the folks on this panel probably share the belief that if a President Biden administration comes in, that there will be relief through the Next Heroes Act for state and local municipalities, which then could flow to the community groups. If a Trump administration continues, then I think the conversation has to get beyond the politics, where our local leaders will have to say to the Trump administration, look, we may disagree about a lot of things, but we all have to agree, like what Perry mentioned, we have to get folks to, I'm sick of wearing a face mask. We're all freaking sick of being in seclusion, wearing a face mask, but if we can all get together as a country and have a unified plan, that's the fastest way for us to get the hell out of this current predicament we're in, and how do we persuade those in the current administration of what might be that plan. And then also, I think everyone, whether in Illinois, whether in Washington, D.C., everyone agrees that we need a strong economic recovery for all states, in rural areas and urban areas. And so that's where our elected officials will have to take away a little bit of the, they'll have to turn the other cheek. And if our current president continues with insults, they have to just work past that and find ways in which there can be mutual self-interest for economic recovery to all Americans, right? And but yes, the reality is that we all have to walk that fine line, and even our boards have strong members and smart members from both sides of the aisle, and that's a great thing, and that's a beautiful thing, because we get a lot of different perspectives on what we should do and how we should look at an issue from all sides. We don't want to unnecessarily burden one portion of the economy and then it doesn't have a strong return, right? So that's the challenge that we are always facing, but it's never been to this level before, at least in my professional career.
I just wanted to jump in and also agree with my friend Dennis, and we're in the same space about walking the fine line. But I also want to mention, just to share that leaders make good decisions, and having effective communications, and going back to my first thought about empathy for the people who are struggling, the people of this country are struggling. Having empathy is extremely important, and it's part of leadership. Our Chinese communities, not just in Chicago and Chinatown, but all around the country, suffered and experienced a lot of hate narratives and hate rhetorics. And it doesn't matter if you're, on what side of the political line. As great leaders, you have to be a healer versus a divider. And right now in our community, it's like we experience hate rhetorics and hate narratives. We are told that we are the ones who start the Kung flu and the China flu. Yeah, it's those kind of communication, unfortunately, has a rippling impact in our communities. When you look at our businesses, like the Chinatown businesses around the country, or in Chicago, right? As of last year today, our businesses have lost 50% of income, right? We work with the Chamber of Commerce in Chinatown. We polled 139 restaurants, large and small, mom and pop. They are closing. And when you have earlier rhetorics like that early on, even before the pandemic hits and before we went remote in place, it hurts a community. We were targeted. That could be very challenging, right, for any leaders like myself, as we depend on support from the federal government to the state and county. But I'm hopeful that, in January, whatever administration may be, they have an opportunity before the 100 days starts, is that critical speech when they take that oath. And this person has the time, the audience of millions of Americans to help heal our country, not to provide a policy plan and what his big plan may be, but take the opportunity right there in front of everybody, millions of Americans, to talk about healing and making sure that those healing process includes policies and actions within the next 100 days. I see many of our young Chinese professionals who work in the Chinatown businesses lost jobs. We know from our data, 45% of our males between the ages of 20 to 45 work in the Chinatown businesses. And as all of us know and read the paper, Chinese and Chinatown businesses suffered drastically. And when you look at the API numbers for unemployment claims across the country from the Department of Labor, just between March and April for the Asian American professionals, there was a rise of 1,300%. And that's historical high, and just for the API communities. So again, we need a leader who has empathy, who understands the needs, who is a great communicator, and for sure, making sure that they have policies in place that are targeted to the most vulnerable, and making sure their priorities are set straight prior to setting these policies out.
Stacey, just to go back to your original question, from my perspective, community organizations, leaders who are on this call, we have to be adaptable, and we have to be smart enough to understand that we have to work on both sides of the aisle. And I'll take as an example for adults with disabilities, the disability community. We have to rely on both sides of the aisle to be able to pass legislation in Washington, D.C. We can't afford to ignore one side. We have to be able to talk and express our issues and make sure that they understand them, and we need their votes. If dollars are going to be allocated and most of our funding comes from the government, I cannot afford to pick sides. I've got to be able to play it right down the middle, explain the issues, explain how important this funding is, and I need votes on both sides of the aisle. And who's ever in charge of the administration, I have to make sure that they're going to sign that legislation. And so in Illinois and at the federal level, we've got two different issues here. And so both with the Early Childhood Association, they lobby for us in certainly in Washington. So they've got to play both sides of the aisle. In Illinois, we have to play on both sides of the aisle because we've got to be able to carry the day and carry the numbers to make sure that sensible, equal legislation gets passed to ensure that the needs of our community are met. And you have to make coalitions of interest, coalitions of like-mindedness, and have respect for both sides. I think that is really critical to our success because we're at the whim of every change administration. In Illinois, I think we have an election 4 times out of every 5 years. That's constant change, and it leaves us very vulnerable and susceptible to those political changes if we're not smart and strategize around the fact that we've got champions on both sides of the aisle, and there's good people on both sides of the aisle. We gotta remember this. I think that the last few years have been an aberration, and I hope we get back to normal as Americans.
I'm looking at our clock, and I know we have looking at 12 minutes here. That gives us just enough time for each of you to kind of make a 2-minute closing argument, if you will, or I don't want to say argument, but closing statement. So I want to get to all of you. So if you can keep your comments within 2 minutes. I don't want to be so I don't know. You want to get us started off on that, Angie?
Go ahead, Felicia. You're already unmuted.
Oh, thanks, Angie. Stacey, and what I was going to say is, so according to the latest numbers, women, they're more than 50% of the population. Women were representing around 53% of registered voters, but there's been a lot of movement on that number because of the excitement with the election coming up. And for the first time, the idea that we're going to break a glass ceiling, the potential to break a glass ceiling in having a woman elected to the second highest office in our country, right? So there's a lot of excitement around that. And before the pandemic, women had just edged out men in participation in the workforce, right? So these are a lot of and those women aren't just Democrats. Those women are of every ideological belief and stance. But the fact remains that we all want the same thing. Women want equal pay for equal work. We want to be safe. Women need to have safety on our streets every single day. And no matter who the politician is, who the elected official is, safety and offering policies that ensure safety for women and girls should be paramount across the board. Economic security and opportunity are also equally important for women across our country. There are so many ways. The truth of the matter is, what we know, our dirty little secret since this pandemic has happened, without the caregiving that happens in homes and across this country, our nation would have come to a standstill. We nearly saw that happen, which means paid time off. For the first time, the concept of paid time off is not being discussed as a woman's issue. It is solidly a family issue. It is solidly an issue for all of us to tackle, and for every elected official to really be involved in, and leaders of corporations, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies as well, to be really concerned about the policies and the practices in their organizations. And so for me, this cuts across every political party. The first 100 days, it's clear to me that you need to identify those policies and practices that will help keep families together, that will help center the experiences of women and girls, that will help keep women in the workforce. Our country cannot be our greatest at anything if we leave half of our participants out on the cutting floor. And whoever that is, that means our immigrant communities. We would have seen a standstill in caregiving from our immigrant communities. And so the intersectional identities that everyone represents are extremely important. And I think it takes me back to how we started off talking about decorum and policies that bring us really together, and the policies that center people. And that's what we're asking for. The policies that center the lived experience, in my case, of women and their intersectional identities, just like the potential of having our first vice president, female vice president, who is intersectional in her identity as an African American, as well as an Indian American or Southeast Asian American to boot. So that's my 2 minutes, and I'll be quiet.
Thank you. Okay, time is 2:51, so we're like 90 seconds. I'm going to break it down to 90 now. Dennis, go for it.
Sure. I think a big word that we've been saying over and over is empathy. And I wanted to add that, to answer one of your questions, like what can elected officials do? How can they create ways in which we can have more empathy toward each other? Leader Greg Harris in the state legislature called me up one time and said, Dennis, what are you doing next Tuesday? Can I bring a group of people over to Chinese Mutual Aid? And he ended up bringing over the Champaign County Farm Bureau, right, which I understood is the largest agricultural bureau in Illinois. And they came to Chicago, and Greg had them tour some of his favorite places in Chicago to kind of like dispel the notion that Chicago's not just full of corrupt people, that like the funding that comes to our community is being done well. And after our tour, the president of the Farm Bureau said, I know we have to make America great again, but this is one of the places that's already great. And it was like, that was a moment, right? Like after George Floyd's the death of George Floyd, as an Asian American leader, I wanted to make sure and talk to our staff, our clients about, we don't want to see the tribalism that occurred like in LA after the Rodney King riots with the Black community and the Korean business owners. And so we took a day to go to the West Side a couple times and joined Alderman Jason Irvin to do cleanups in West Garfield Park. And it was powerful to have Asian American faces in a Black community. And they, like, neighbors were thanking us for being there, and we were thanking them for blazing the civil rights trail for us as immigrants, right? And how can our elected officials create more of those moments so that we are not like looking at our differences, but that we are celebrating those differences as making us one stronger community. And so that's my hope and prayer, is that empathy will happen regardless of the next administration.
Mm-hmm.
Dennis, thank you. I'm like going down the rows of my screen here. So Paul, you're the next one in line.
Well, I just want to share, thank you again for ABC and Stacey for having this conversation, and with all my peers and colleagues today. I think it's really important for after the election that whoever made these elected officials may be in their seats, is to recognize what the priorities are. And I going back to what Felicia said, is pinpointing targeted needs to the most vulnerable communities. And that's so critical. And there is equity there, because even though we're not spreading across, but we're talking about the most vulnerable. And I can say that it's the immigrant community. You know, on my experience, you know, the Black and Brown and the API communities, who are what I consider the backbone of many of the large metropolitan cities in the country, especially Chicago. But making sure the priorities are right, listening to the community leaders and the needs, what needs to be done. I think that's really important. And then finally, and what we've seen for the last 6, 7 months is, how do we handle COVID? It has this rippling effect through childcare, employment, small businesses, our nonprofits. And so this individual, or these individuals, must take account what is that game plan or this roadmap for success for the next few years.
Angie?
Thank you. Thank you for having us. So I think, you know, as a nonprofit organization, we're obviously nonpartisan. And so for us, you know, the work doesn't really change. We're holding our elected officials accountable regardless of who they are. No permanent friends, no permanent enemies. So it's not just our elected officials. Frankly, it's our foundation leaders. It's our cultural institutions. I think the important thing is to remember that, you know, there is a big part of the population. I think COVID did something where it highlighted the gaps we already had in a really real and intense way. So this isn't new, right? It's just in our face in a way that it wasn't before. And so for us, what we've really been focusing on is continuing to create access for the community that we work with, access to the cultural institutions, access to stable employment, access to healthcare, right? And all of these priorities is about access and making sure that there's an important segment of the population that isn't regulated or relegated to their 1 month, their one history month, but that they're really being fully, completely, and holistically integrated into the community, and not just with elected officials, but really across the board. I think everyone has some deep soul searching that we need to do about how are we operating as institutions and as individuals, to make sure that the most vulnerable in the community are getting connected to the things that they need.
All right, Angie, thank you. We literally have 3 minutes left, so I'm giving Ray, Karen, and Miss Perry your back. So why don't we start in that order, and you each have a minute, and then we're done.
Okay,
Great.
thank you. And thank you, Stacey, for all your hard work and all your support for the community. So we do really appreciate that. Just really quickly is, you know, COVID-19, hunger, poverty, you know, it doesn't understand race or gender or any of those things. There's no geographic lines. My sincere hope and prayer is that our elected officials, this new group comes in and works for all of us, and understands that there's people hurting, and that, you know, they have a responsibility to pass legislation that, you know, targets the people most in need, and you know, think about us as a people and come together as a nation, and in a more, I would hope, compassionate way, and that's my hope for our next set of elected officials.
Thank you, Ray. Miss Karen?
I would just say thank you. It's great to join all of you. And I'm going to appeal to the other side of the ballot box. We've been talking about elected officials. I need folks to get out and vote. And I would say that the fight really starts on election day, because after we vote, and so often we go back to our different ways of life, we have to hold people accountable. And so often the accountability factor does not exist. And then the last thing I would say, along with that accountability, the problems that we've talked about, the challenges that we've talked about in this hour are so great that each of us, and we're all doing it, but I would say every citizen has to determine their role in problem solving for society. That's the only way we're going to get ahead and get out of all of this.
And Ms. Perry, you have the last, we're almost at 3 here.
Okay, I'll try to talk fast. So, you know, I view this entire situation as an opportunity for America to reclaim itself, right? You know, we're on a precipice. We're either going to realize the promise of equality for all people in this nation, or we're going to fall backwards into the abyss. And, you know, we're looking at a test of our nation's character, and it's going to reveal the truth about who we are. And none of the things that we're discussing here are going to mean a thing if our democracy is destroyed, if our voters aren't able to vote, or their votes aren't properly counted, right? And so, you know, looking at the restoration of the Voting Rights Act, the restoration of the pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act, you know, we're witnessing right now, you know, what that provision was there for in the first place, right? Is to prevent voter suppression. So I think we have some overarching issues that until we take care of those, kind of nothing else matters, right? If you're not even at the table, you can't have a discussion about what's on the menu, right? So we're in for a long period of healing, right? Of unification, which is essential. And I'll tell you a story just from today here at the DuSable Museum. I got a request from our brand new Consul General of El Salvador, who is new to the city of Chicago, new to our Chicago Consular Corps, and we have the second largest diplomatic corps in the country. A lot of people don't realize that. And he had a delegation in from El Salvador, and where did he want to come? He called me, reached out to me so that they could visit the DuSable Museum of African American History, right? And so it's that type of sort of unification of human beings, you know, of humanity, of empathy, as our other guests here have talked about. And until we can get back to that level of humanity, where we are appreciating each other and taking care of each other, none of these other things are going to matter. So I would echo Karen's comment. Get out and vote. I got my little do this, and let's come back stronger, heal and celebrate and bring unity to this nation.
I think that is a great message to leave it on, the voting message, right? I want to thank each and every one of you. Thank you so much for sharing what we have ahead and what we have ahead with elected officials. So
thank you, Stacey. You've been great.
Go out and vote, everybody. Go vote.
All right. Thank
you.
Take care, everyone.
And thank you,